think we'll start. Okay, welcome folks. This session is Virtualizing Lync Server 2013. This is actually the first part. There's a two-part session and I'll explain why. This is around planning and architecture. And then tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, Seth is going to talk about testing and deployment. And you're probably thinking, why? Well, when we went through the process of virtualizing Lync, we originally decided to do one paper. And actually, the papers got released yesterday, in case you don't know about them. There's two papers. They're on Microsoft.com downloads. If you do a search for Lync Server 2013 virtualization, you'll see two of them. So originally, we wanted to put one paper together. And what we found was it was 120 pages. Just some light reading at night when you're in bed, you know. So what we did was we split them in half. We said, let's look at this as if a customer was going to virtualize. We said, okay, we're going to have a planning and architecture document, which is sort of, think of it, I hate to use the term, but do's and don'ts of virtualization. And also give you an idea, a glimpse in what we did inside Microsoft to validate what we're presenting here. And then the other one was around testing, using a test plan guide, key health indicators, actually deploying it. So think of that as that second document is when you're about to pilot. You're about to go in and say, okay, I understand this stuff now. I now want to go and do it. What do I need? What is the collateral that I need to make sure that I'm doing the right things at the right time, looking for the right values that with all modalities turned on, it's going to be good. So my name's Campbell Gunn, Seth McHugh. I'm a program manager in the Lync Server team, focused on virtualization. I sort of inherited virtualization around the end of the 2010 timeframe, so I saw the paper there that was interesting. I'll leave it at that. So I said, all right, if we're going to make some changes in 2013, what were the changes? And I just highlighted them earlier. Seth, I'll let you introduce yourself in more detail.
Yeah, I'm Seth. Hello?
Yeah, there.
I'm Seth McClure. I actually work in the Lync Online mainly, and I came in to work with Campbell on making this virtualization white paper happen.
So I was sort of like the project manager, making sure that the right tone was set, gathering all the resources. You'll see that some of the work we've done. Seth was more like our lab person, making sure on the ground that things were working. We also have Brandon in the front there. I'm going to give him kudos. He's our KHI guru. I'm going to leave it at that. He's the man. If you want to know about any key health indicators, there's the guy to go and see. All right? He put these together, and I'm going to give you the sort of the top 10 there. So let's get started. So first thing I start off is why virtualize. So the reason I sort of took this approach, and you'll see it in the white papers, is trying to cater for multiple audiences with virtualization. So you're going to have customers that come in and say, we want to virtualize Lync. Never done virtualization before. What do I need to consider? How do I do it? Also, you can have a customer come and say, yep, we've virtualized everything. I now want to know what I want to put Lync in that environment. Another aspect is our field, our sales folk. They actually take this material and they have some additional collateral that they go in MCS, Microsoft Consulting Service, will go and engage with you to build out your pilot, to build out your lab, etc. And the fourth one, which is an interesting one, is our partners. Partners such as HP, Dell. So what they do is they take this material and they go into their labs and they start testing their next generation hardware. Okay, so you can see what we've tried to balance all these different audiences to read this material and get something out of it. So why virtualize? So one thing is hardware and software approach. So trying to look at best practices, all right? So you have your hardware, your base platform, then you have virtualization, and then you have Lync, so software on software. Things about, as we're going to talk about, is guest and host recommendations. We'll talk about deploying it, what the aspects of deploying it, recommended practices. We'll look at performance at scale. So I'm going to talk about some key health indicators, the top 10 critical key health indicators. And then I'm going to give you a testing approach, and this is an interesting one. You're going to get a glimpse of what we actually did inside Microsoft. So one thing that we looked at is, as if I was the customer, so I sort of played this role as the customer, and I said, if I was the customer and I had these Microsoft folk coming to me and I want to test this out, what would it look like? All right, using real customer hardware, you're going to see a bill of materials, you're going to actually see what we did to give you a glimpse. So why virtualize? This is the sort of standard slide here. You see the total cost of ownership. You want to reduce your infrastructure costs. You want to create value and faster low-cost services. So constantly, when one of the things that comes up in virtualization is, your admin ratio to the amount of service that they have to manage. That's a constant value that also gets looked. It helps you with capacity planning as well. all right? So you've got this base, especially with your front ends, and you've got one front end and you've set that up in a particular configuration. You can then start scaling it out. You've got this capacity planning approach that you can take. Standardizing your hardware platform is another aspect. Really operational efficiency points you can see there is business continuity, giving you that operational flexibility that you can shut down a front end, move it to another host, bring it back up again. You need to be careful about that, and I'll talk about those aspects. And the last point there was improving the server to administration ratio. Just out of curiosity, who's running, I'm going to ask this and I'm going to do the disclaimer as well, who's running VMware? Half the audience. That's about right. I always, when I talk to customers, I find 50-50. 50% is Hyper-V and 50% VMware. I'm not going to talk about VMware here. However, there are key points in this throughout these slides that you can extract to put into your VMware environment. Okay. The reason being is I'm not VMware, I'm Microsoft. But certainly I encourage you to talk to your VMware salesperson or technical consultant, etc., to put pressure on them to come to us and work together. All right. That's definitely the case. We want to work with our partners. They are, if you haven't heard about it, we have a website page. It's called SVVP. It's the Server Virtualization Program. We have a number of partners that are on there, not just VMware, but Red Hat, for example, Citrix, a number of partners that work with us to virtualize our stack on top of theirs. So I encourage you to do that. So one thing that's significant here is when you're virtualizing is that we provide support to virtualize all workloads. And you can see all the list there of the workloads that are supported that it can be virtualized. IM&P, presence going through the stack there. One thing that you need to think about when you're virtualizing is you're getting that resource abstraction. That can be good and that can be bad. And you've got to look at both sides of the coin. Right? It allows you to share your applications in that virtualized platform, that you can abstract away from the CPU, the memory, the network, and disk. And you'll see further in this discussion that this session I'm going to have with you guys is that you need to factor those in. You don't want to starve those resources from the application sitting on top of that virtualization stack. One thing that's significant about this slide is that it's designed to take the full physical server capabilities. So one aspect is whatever the physical requirements are for hardware are the same for when you virtualize. So dual processor, hex core, 32 gig of RAM for the front end, same applies here that you put on your virtualized. We're getting out of that, oh, well, if you virtualize, you need this different to physical, and it confused people. They're like, what do I need for my hardware? What do I need to do here? So we're getting out of that. It's the same. And one of the reasons is that with the Server 2012 platform, we don't have any restrictions on the amount of V cores that we can use, the amount of memory that can be consumed, the amount of disk. With Server 2008 and the Lync Server 2010 timeframe, we were limited by the number of V cores. It was 4. It was basically crippling the product as a result. Server 2012, we didn't have that issue. Things to consider as well, your call quality. So if you've got here, key component, obviously, for a Lync server, it is heavy in and CPU resources for media transcoding. You also need a high-performance network, all right, especially if you're doing significant media streams. Other things is that, this is what I mentioned earlier, it's software on software. You've got this abstraction that's happening between your physical hardware and the Lync platform, all right, because you've got virtualization sitting in between that. Also, spikes in database activity can also impact. So some of the things to think about here is that when you do have impact, you'll start seeing things around latency, packet drops, jitter as a result. You'll start seeing those early indications, especially from the client end. You'll start seeing some of those indications there. I'm going to talk about how you can manage that as well. Other parts, configuration here is that really you can't use that portability function that you get with Microsoft Server 2012 R2, right? So the mobile VXD support and things like that, where you can just suddenly shift your VXDs across to another host with not supported. And you can understand why. This is a real-time application, right, the Lync product, right? And when the server team looked at Server 2012 team looked at it, they looked at it from a more traditional application, right, a web-based application, all right? So that was a significant thing that you need to be conscious of. Other things is Lync Server 2013 has a rich set of application failover techniques. So this is things such as data replication within the pool and also between pools. All right, so we need to support that. So other considerations here. This was one that we found in the lab, and we didn't see a significant improvement in performance by enabling it, and that is disable the hyperthreading on all hosts. Right? We really didn't see any gain by enabling it. Oversubscription. Oversubscription is a big no-no with Hyper-V. Right? I know in VMware they tend to plug that a little bit more, but the Lync product does not like oversubscription. Yeah, question? Yes, I'll get to it. The question is, what did we do in our test? Did we use the default user profile? The answer is yes, and I'm going to talk about it in a lot more detail in these slides. I've got a lot of slides to get through, so I don't want to, but yes, to answer your question, we did use the default user. We did some tweaking a little bit with it. Seth actually is going to talk a little bit tomorrow about where the tweaks occurred. Partly is the hardware that we had, also the number of clients that we're actually utilizing to do that. So we actually have some minor alterations we did in default user profile when we use the Lync stress tool. But you'll get to see that in both our sessions. It's a good point. Thank you. So do not oversubscribe on your CPU there. Maintain a 1-to-1 virtual CPU to physical CPU ratio. Ensure that your host servers support the nested page tables and extended page tables. All right. Memory again. Do not configure dynamic memory. All right. What will happen is you will starve again. The media stack is very sensitive to memory, not having sufficient memory, especially when it's encoding. And do not overcommit on the host servers. All right, you still need to provide some memory CPU to the host servers. You don't want to starve them with all the guests sitting on top. So live migration and any portability or failover techniques that Hyper-V provides are not supported because we're a real-time service. That's probably the significant one. So other considerations with wide virtualized is network. So who's using 2010 now, just out of curiosity, in virtualized? Are you using BMQ? Lee, keep your hand up if you're using BMQ. Anybody? Wow, okay. So BMQ was a really interesting one. It was Microsoft's attempt to allow the direct plumbing of your virtual NIC down to your physical NIC. And it was either Broadcom or Intel. They were very specific drivers. I'd find it was really, when talking to customers, I'd find it was really confusing when they would have network performance problems. The first question I would ask them if they were using VMQ, did you update your drivers? Oh, yeah, we did that 6 months ago, 12 months ago. And they realized they didn't have the later driver. So we still do that, all right? And it's what we call synthetic NIC support and performance. And you can still use VMQ. Again, use physical NIC segregation. So what I mean is that you would have a NIC for your host, and then for each workload that's virtualized, you would have your NICs appropriate for that. You're not going to have everything going through the one NIC or through the host NIC. You want to segregate it. That's what I'm meaning there. If you're using, should be disabled, is the VM chimney, so the TCP offload. This is, again, minimizing the NIC performance when you're impacted by offloading the TCP processing. One that was a new one, and this is a really big thing when we worked with the server folks, the Server 2012 folks, was the single root I/O virtualization. All right, we recommend it. We actually get a lot of performance from using SRIOV. But again, it depends on the particular host, the partner that you're working with, the hardware platform. So, for example, with HP, depending on which gen hardware you have, you actually need to contact them and get the BIOS or download it from their site. There are specific requirements that the hardware provider, hardware partner provides. This is you need to go and support this. And again, basically what this is a better support. It's native in the Hyper-V product, server product, to allow plumbing on the synthetic NIC from your virtual adapter, NIC network adapter, down to the physical one. Right? It's their way of directly doing it, so that you're not got any layer of software that, like the BMQ driver, that's doing the interpretation between the two. It's direct plumbing straight through, and you do get a lot of performance from that. Storage side here, you can see to use fixed or pass-through disks rather than dynamic disks. I'll talk a little bit more in detail what happens about that, and also with snapshotting. Some don't do snapshotting, and I'll explain why shortly about that one, please. So who's using 2010 now and is about to go to 2013? Okay, because this is the one that's significant for you guys. Who's using 2013 now? So we've got about, I think, 2/3 are on 2013 and probably about 1/3 is on 2010. So let's just talk a little bit about the architectural changes that happened in 2013 in comparison to 2010. So the first one was the back-end database role, or the BE role. So one significant point here is it's no longer used to store real-time data in the Lync pool. Again, the reasons for this was to eliminate our single point of failure. Again, performance. Where we saw some performance issues around this was a lot of the times customers would use some type of SAN storage. They would have their back-end databases sitting on that SAN storage with other myriads of application databases. And then they'd wonder why there was performance issues in their Lync user pool. And this was a result because they were sharing the back-end. So we tried this based on customer feedback. We decided then to move more to the front end. Okay. Again, what it really is providing is overall persistent blob storage. This is definitely significant from Lync Server 2010. It's quite ironic because we've sort of come a full circle. We went in back end, the live communication server, it was all on the back end, front end, then we went to the back end, then we had to come back to the front end. So bear with us, all right? All right, let's talk about the front ends here. So front end server role, it's handling all the transactions for the user. So your presence, contacts, conferencing information is all stored and managed on the front end. It does, therefore, have higher hardware requirements than in 2010. All right, so that's the big significant. The significance of that is that you're now going to 6 cores. You're now requiring 32 gig of RAM, and this is minimum. All right, you used to get away with 2010 if you're using all my delis around 24 gig, around that mark, down to 16 gig I saw in some machines. Again, that's dependent on your workloads, right? If you're just using IMMP or whether you're using IMMP, voice and video, and conferencing, etc. AV conferencing server. So 2010, you could have a separate AV conferencing server. With 2013, it's now part of the front-end server role. There's no longer separate monitoring or archiving server role. Again, there's services running in the front-end server role. One of the significant ones is the 264 codec is now, in fact, a video requirement for video conferencing also runs on the front-end server role. So now you're starting to see there's a lot of things that are happening on the front ends. All right, and again, they require additional CPU and memory to support that. So be conscious of these points. So now, certainly ask any questions during this. I mean, I'm welcome to that. Yeah. On the front end or the back end? The back end is actually reduced. It's only 16 gig of memory now. We actually tapered down the memory actually on the back end. That's a good point. The question was the gentleman here didn't see any changes on the back end for SQL Server requirements, for hardware requirements in 2013 in comparison to 2010. And in fact, in 2013, we reduced that. We reduced the amount of memory and the amount of CPU requirements that's required on the back end in comparison. Because we shifted everything to the front end now. But that is a really good point. Thank you. Yes?
The 12-core 32 gig RAM, it covers something like 6,000 users. Is there any guidance, scaling out to smaller numbers of users, significantly? I need an HA pool of 500 users. There's no guidance at all for tailoring those resources back down.
You're going to see this. We're going to talk about it. Because it's the number one question that gets asked every time. My mailbox is full of questions like that. And that was one thing I said, I'm definitely putting this in the white papers. In fact, a lot of this material is from the white papers. So you'll have stuff to take back to your organization and share with your colleagues. It's pretty important. But yeah, the question was, what are the user requirements? Like if I've got 6,000, 7,000 users, correct me if I'm wrong, what's the hardware requirements? What do I need to be able to cater for that? Is that the right question? For 500. Well, what's interesting is that we also did testing on standard edition as well, not just enterprise edition, because that's actually a common question. You'll see here some of the key health indicators where you can tailor back to the particular amount of users. I think one thing to be careful of is that customers fall into this trap of, well, I'm only doing IMP and I've only got 500 users. I only want to use this hardware. And you're like, okay, for how long? Because I guarantee 3 months down the track, I get the email from the same customer saying, yeah, now I've got problems where I want to run voice and video and conferencing, and my 500 user count is now at 1,000 user count, and I'm having problems trying to scale. And I'm like, yeah, why don't you look at the capacity that you're going to run everything and forecast it from a capacity planning point of view. But yeah, I'll talk to you specifically to your point of just how you can scale and move that elasticity of how many users you've got depending on your environment. That's a good point. Thank you.
And I want to just add to that so in tomorrow's session, I'm going to talk about using the performance and stress tool, which in a lot of ways is a great way to test not only your user scale, but it's a great way to test what your actual usage model is. Is it only I'm in presence? How much is I'm in presence is it? How much AV conferencing is it? And it's a great way to tweak that, and then you can actually come up with, hey, this is what I need to support this user base. Very cool tool.
So that's actually a good segue. So stress and performance. So what I'm going to talk about now is, in fact, what we did inside Microsoft to validate the white papers and to provide more information in the hands of you guys so that you can go off and do it in your own environment. So one of the things that we used is the Lync server stress and performance tool. All right? And it's a validation tool set. It's allowing you to actually do stress testing of a targeted deployment infrastructure. It's typically done in a controlled lab, a pilot. It's not done in production. You don't want to do it. It's a step before that, in fact. You can target, as Seth just mentioned, a specific usage pattern. So you can tweak things. Example would be that I have in every hour I have 5 conferences with 6 users in each conference and things like that. And you want to target that specific load against your deployment infrastructure. So it simulates the individual workloads. So every workload can be tweaked, such as I am in presence example here. It really allows you to answer that gentleman's, understand your capacity management. So what does it look like with 500 users? What does it look for 1,000 users? I'm going to change my modalities. It uses the footprint, and I think a gentleman asked, it uses the default, we use the default user profile as the standard point. So the way we decided to tackle this was, what if I was a customer and what would I do? What materials are available to me? Do we need to update the material so that the customer has the right information? Again, it allows you really to have proper design and deployment. It doesn't preclude you having a good solid infrastructure, right? We don't get into things such as Active Directory or certificate service or using the Office Web Application Server or load balance reverse proxy. There is plenty of documentation around that in the regular documentation for Lync server, setting all of that up. Okay. What's interesting in this particular circumstance with our lab is we virtualized everything. We wanted to see what happens if we did virtualize everything. What would that look like? So we didn't get into a lot of situations where we're mixing physical and virtual within our lab environment. And there's an important point here. It's performed after your technical design, so after you worked out your technical design, and it's before you actually do your piloting. Though I have had customers ask me about, well, can I just pilot in a very self-contained prestige environment because that's the only hardware I have, right? I've outlaid all this money for hardware and I want to test it against that. As long as there's no active users on that, like let's say that before your pilot, you use that hardware specifically to go and use the Lync stress tool to do that. That's okay, but remember you want to tear that down completely and then rebuild it for your pilot. Don't just naturally then flow on to your pilot. You could have some remnants, you could have some things that could cause you issues in the long run. And one thing is it requires clients. All right, so there's a couple of different ways, and in fact, Seth will talk about it tomorrow, is you can have virtual clients, so you can simulate your clients virtually, or you can have physical clients. All right, you need the clients actually, and you'll see in a diagram very shortly just how we did that. We had an internal client, we had external clients, and we actually virtualized them just purely from the amount of machines required to have physical clients. You can understand there. So that's really important part 2. Don't forget your clients. So one of the things we looked at is, okay, how can we measure a good environment versus a bad environment, or an environment that we're testing that's going to go off the rails, so to speak. So what we did was we created a set of key health indicators. And what I'm showing you here is a snapshot of the 10 critical key health indicators. There's about 80-odd key health indicators. You can see the link there where it's provided. It's under the Network Planning, Monitoring, and Troubleshooting Server Guide. In fact, I'll give another plug again. Brandon, our KHI guru that was part of this project, put these together and was really monitoring them throughout our project. So it really gives you the basis of a good pass. I've got a good, solid environment. If you see where there's some of the key health indicators starting to not meet the required settings or the required values, then what you can do then is start going in and do some further testing and look at the larger key health indicators to see where your problem is. It's sort of like, okay, I see this problem, but I need to find the root cause of the problem. All right, think of it that type of approach. So you need to really then step down and do a full analysis of it. I would recommend, and what we did in the lab is we went through the whole 80 of them just to make sure, and I recommend that too. Don't just look at this 10. But it's a good sort of gauge whether things are going as planned. So this slide's a little bit hard to read, but it's also in the document. These are the sort of 10 key health indicators. So you can see, obviously, the big one that we look for is processor information, percent processor time. So under 80%, all right, is generally a good thing. I think it's with all applications, a bit of a rule of thumb there. Looking at the memory and available megabytes, that's another one, all right, so it's greater than 20% total of the system. Other areas there you want to look at, and I'll talk in more detail specifically, is around the DB store queue latency in milliseconds. This is on the front end, and the SPROC latency. You can see some of the things that would cause some issues about that. So essentially, if it was high, you could have network performance problems between your front end and your back end. All right, so be conscious of that one. Yeah, so I'm going to talk a little bit more detail of those ones. So they're the 10 key health indicators to look at. So within our project, we actually run the project for 6 months, just to give you an idea. It happened to go over the Christmas, so we obviously have a shutdown period there. But we ran it for about 6 months. This is an example of the hardware actually used. Again, we're not starting with a particular hardware vendor. This was just the vendor we used at the time. So this is HP hardware you can see here. But if you have a contract, a supplier for, say, Dell or another supplier hardware vendor, by all means, contact them and start building that. But you get an idea of just what we did here with the hardware specs. So we had 8 DL560s. These were the Gen 8 chassis. Within them, we had 4 Intel 4650 processors with 128 gig of RAM. All right. There you can see the bill of materials that we did for the hardware components. Notice, I think one significant part to note as well in that is the very bottom there. We have the 96, the HP 600 gigabyte 6G SAS drives. They're at 15,000 speed as well. What we didn't do was SSD. So that's something to note on. We purely took the mechanical drives aspect first. Again, using the stress tool, using the default user profile, look at what performance you're going to get out of SSD drives. And you may do, which a lot of customers do, a combination of SSD and mechanical and things like that. So factor that in as well. So here's actually a layout of one of the hosts that we did. So each virtual server was configured with 12 cores, 32 gig of memory allocated. We went off and used the recommendations from the physical server specs, so minimum requirements from there, and there's a link there for the planning documentation. So you can see that we've got, and I'll go into a bit more detail of just how we allocated our cores. So we have internal storage as well as external storage from that, and then our network NICs based on there. And you'll see very shortly a breakdown of the different roles and what host they sat on. Then you'll see why we did the NIC configuration like that. So let's talk a little bit more about the host storage configuration. So here's the internal disk and external disks. So we did RAID 0 and then RAID 1, and we worked out to, of course, they were all RAID 10. The capacity, as we increase in capacity. And then the interesting one to look at is just the amount of IOPS. And one of the things about this that you need to remember is that we are using SQL Server. Right? SQL Server is obviously processing back and forth between our application and itself. So we need to be conscious of the amount of IOPS that we're pushing through between that to give us the right performance. So here's a topology that we used. So you can see that, hopefully this works. I'll use the mouse. So here you can see that we've got our external clients sitting. Then we've obviously got a DMZ, and we've got the edges and reverse proxy. and then we have the interior part of our network. We have our internal clients that are sitting, if I can get that right, sitting just here. We have the Office Web Application Servers, Active Directory. Here's our back end. So we have the back end here. Here's our witness for the back end that's sitting there because of the mirrored configuration. You obviously need a witness to that. I had an interesting question from a customer, and I want to answer this, is that one of the statements they were saying is that one of the front ends, because maybe I'm using only two, and the third one doesn't have to be the same hardware spec. The way that, in fact, Windows Fabric that's sitting under the covers there that manages the data, the high availability and the disaster recovery of that front-end pool is that if one of them goes down, that load then shifts to those two others. And if you don't have the right hardware specs, you're going to starve or potentially have one of your front ends fall over as a result. So always keep the same hardware for those front ends. That's a really important part. We were also using, we also had voice gateways, so we actually were going through and actually placing the calls and making sure that, in fact, so as you can see here, this is probably not unlike your own environments, all right? And this was one of the significant things that we wanted to do, was make sure that we could make it as real life to a customer's environment as possible. Otherwise, you know, it would have been a pen and paper exercise for us, and I don't think that's any value to you guys. So let's look at the virtual machine placement. So one thing is what we did was the guest machines were just spread across the host, really in order to test performance. We didn't get too bogged down with co-location of specific server roles, right? We didn't test that. Really what we did was we did a logical separation of those roles. One of the interesting points, and I'm going to say this one, is we didn't place the front end virtual guests on the same host. It's kind of a really basic thing, right? So if I've got two guests that are front ends and they're on a host and that host goes down and I've only got 3 front ends, I'm kind of in trouble, aren't I? So you want to make sure from your spread there. I have seen customers where they just stripe, and this is similar to what we've done here, is stripe our front ends back and forth, right? And they have enough hardware, they factor in, they're literally doubling up on their hardware to provide that so that the front ends can take the load. And that's really what you've got to factor in. If I lose a host and I lose those guests and they got front end, and based on that load, can the rest of my front end or my user pool take that load, right? So you may want to, in your lab, and I suggest it strongly, using the Lync stress tool, is test it out. I mean, think of it like your disaster recovery program. I'm going to walk up to the host and I'm going to pull the plug, literally pull the plug. What happens when you're simulating that test, that load? Right, that's probably a good thing to do. So you can see here that I'm keeping the virtual servers in the same pool. So keeping them relevant to the same pool, close together in the same pool, from a rack host perspective, is going to give you some more resilience and performance-wise. So it's something to think about as well down onto the physical layer. You can see how we've broken up the logical processes across the physical host and the layout that we've done. So you can see the first 3 front ends, or the 3 front ends across the first 3 hosts. We have our back ends and going the next, the edge. These are the clients. These are the test clients that are running our domain controllers. You can see that we've got a fair amount of clients that are occurring across this as well. You can see that we have the back-end witness, and these ones here are actually Office web applications. One thing you want to try and do, notice that the way we put our edges and our clients, we try to keep that away from the user pool, because we didn't want to generate any artificial load on those front ends and back ends that were, not so much artificial load, but additional load that was coming from those edges or coming from the Active Directory, et cetera, right? We wanted to keep that really, because that's what you're targeting for, right? You're targeting for that user pool, right? Because that's where the amount of significant investment's been, or was going to be. So what did we observe? We actually did multiple tests over that 6 months. We had a person that was just, we call him the test run master. He was running tests all the time on this. And what we did was we just cranked it up. Even though we had 3 front ends and a back end, we actually cranked it right up. I think we got high as like 45,000 users and just watched everything just swamp the whole pool. And we deliberately just crashed the pool just to see what would happen, right? So as we did that, we started tapering down the users on that user pool. And looking at the KHIs and seeing and bringing it down to the reasonable level, all right? And so what we did with the 3-user front-end pool, with the back-end, with the hardware that you just saw, we actually got to around a 10,000 user count for that pool, right? And that's based in this lab. This is not something that indicative that you're going to get in your environment because hardware is different. You know, you may get different results if you're using a blade configuration. All right, there's totally different aspects that you need to consider. This was our observations in the lab. Though the solution did provide high resource utilization, we sort of pushed the pedal to the metal, so to speak. Right, we really pushed up CPU utilization and we capped it at around nearly at the 80% mark because we wanted to see just sustained, you know, constant user demand workload on that pool, what would happen. But it was within the top 10 critical KHI's limits, so that was interesting. But again, for you guys, testing is required. That again, if you take the default user profile and you start tweaking it based on your organization, plus you may have totally different hardware, you know, things subject to change. It's sort of my disclaimer, if you like. All right, I can't guarantee that every environment is going to be exactly the same, but we're giving you some guidance here.
And one thing I'll note on this slide as well is we like Campbell said, we pushed this hardware as far as we could with the lab that we had. So this doesn't include any redundancy. So I always like to say, make sure you add a front end, make sure you add an edge server, make sure you add redundancy, whether it's physical or virtual.
Thank you. So one thing that we found with the Lync server stress tool was there's a ramp-up period, and it caught us by surprise, to tell you the truth. We're like, wow, what was this spike that happened? And what happens is that in the testing period, when we first kicked off a test run, for about 30 minutes, we would just see this huge uptake of all the resources, and it would spike, and then it would drop, and then even out. And it sort of caught us by surprise. We thought it was a bug in the product. We're like, what's going on here? And then we did some further investigation. We found, okay, there is this ramp up. Because what's happening is the Lync stress tool is starting to kick everything in, right? It's loading its configuration files. The clients are all loading configuration files. Users are all logging in. So I had 10,000 users logging in. It's kind of going to peak everything, right? And then also, too, is Lync server starting up background tasks. It's starting to clean things up. Certainly, it starts to run its tasks, its jobs, to make sure that then the Lync server product is actually running in an optimum solution. So here's an example of what we did in the lab, and this is, I think it's in the guide as well, of what the ramp up looks like. And what we were focused here, I think from memory, was the processor utilization. This was an example of one front end that was happening. This was FES 01 or FES 01. So this was one front end and the ramp up that occurred on that front end for the users that were homed on the pool. So you can see there's that significant ramp up that happens, and then it sort of tapers off. Again, we really pushed the pool to be at that constant state of high utilization, right? But it was within the KHI limits. So, yeah. Let's now have a look at SQL Express, because this, yeah.
That was a 2-hour snapshot? What we just saw? Left to right, that's 2 hours?
I think that, I'm just having a look, sorry.
And it's hard to read.
Yeah, no, that was, so, 18, yes. Yes. We would run them over a 24-hour period. We would run each test run over 20, and then we'd do a minimum of 2 before we declare it was bad or good. We were pretty strict about that. We had one person that was focused on looking at that all the time, saying, okay, are these numbers good? No. We even took a very brutal stance and said if one KHI out of those 10 was out of whack, we'd scrub the test and redo it again. We were pretty brutal about that because you guys are looking at this stuff and saying, I need to go and do this in my own environment, and there's nothing worse. I would get an email if we didn't do this right. Did we set up media bypass? No, we didn't. Thanks, Brandon. No, we didn't. We didn't set up. Yeah. Sure. Right. Correct.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, if you're not doing things like mediation server colo on the front end, you're going to see proc utilization go down, and you probably can bring your user base up just based on that.
Correct.
So that would be one factor when you're doing your own test to be able to tweak that, the resources that you need for your own environment.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think we tried all modalities, right? We didn't do any tweaking per se. Excuse me. We didn't do any tweaking per se. We just said, let's turn on all modalities as if we didn't do any tweaking, what would happen? Right? Let's just run and see what happens here. So it gives you a base to work from Then you can start doing some further tweaking, right, based on your environment. Let's do some media bypass. Let's change the default user profile because I'm not doing, in this predetermined time, telephone calls or voice and video. The amount of conferences has changed. You can start doing that tweaking based on your environment. Yeah, that's a good point. So SQL Express, let's talk a little bit about SQL Express. So when you install Lync Server, obviously, the front end, it goes off and installs SQL Server Express. The way the SQL Server Express product is set up, it actually uses only the first 4 procs, right? So what happens when we did our testing is we found those first 4 procs were very high in utilization because that's where SQL Server was sitting. Lync Server will use those 4 procs as well, all right? And there's a couple of reasons, but there's a TechNet article that you can go and have a look at why that is the case. It's a stance that SQL has around the SKUs. So obviously they have SQL Server Express, then they have SQL Server Standard Edition, and they have SQL Server Enterprise Edition, right? You think about the SKU and the business market model around that, right? It's around those sort of things. But here's an important thing to think about. If you're finding that your front ends are getting at above 90% utilization, CPU utilization, you need to start factoring that I may need you will need another front end or number of front ends, right? Because you're reaching capacity on that user pool. Now that's based on your user load. If you're really you saw in our 3 front ends there, we're at 10,000 users. If you've got 20,000 users, chances are you want to double it at a minimum, right? So factor that one in. I think the other point here is that, the key part to look at this is, key KHIs to look at is the Q latency and Sprock latency, and you can see the 2 points or 3 points of why. The first one is the Q latency is the amount of time in milliseconds that it takes your request to lead from the front-end queue towards the back-end database. So you want to watch that particular one. In that case, if you then look at the Sprock latency, which is the amount of time it takes from the SQL Server database to process the request, if you combine the two together, those 2 values, it's really showing you that whether your CPU utilization is really affecting your underlying SQL Server databases, all right? But it also gives you an idea of potentially if you're going to have spikes within your environment based on those users that are still able to handle the user load. So these are 2 to watch based on what your users are doing has the effect. Because you can see that presence information, signing in, signing out, things like that. That's all happening on the front end. So watching these 2 values and the activity is of the users, you can say, well, is 10,000 okay or less based on you can see how all these factors start coming in together. All right, it's not just one magic number.
And I'll add, when you're looking at the KHIs, you want to look at for this specific reason, you want to look at all your cores. You don't want to look at the roll-up process utilization number because that's going to get skewed. You're going to get ruined by averages, which happens a lot when you're looking at performance data. So I highly recommend, and Campbell will show this later, to look at each one of those cores individually and see if you're having a problem like this.
Right. Actually, that's a good segue. Here's an example of that. So you can see here with SQL Express and the first 4 cores that are actually being on that particular front end that we're looking at, and we're seeing the effects of that. And you can see, in fact, just what's interesting is you're seeing that high utilization at the beginning. Anyone like to have a guess why? We just talked about it earlier. Who's it? Sorry, the logons, the ramp up. Yeah, you actually get a prize there. We got a prize, and now they're all going to be like, I'm going to jump in on that question. All right, so yeah, it's the ramp up. So you're going to have that initial ramp up, and then you can see things actually settle out quite significantly as a result of that. So, be conscious of that first 30 minutes as you use that Lync stress tool, you're going to get that initial ramp up. And it can be disconcerting when you first see it. You start sort of scratching your head. Let's dive into now a little bit about the hypervisor. Again, this is looking at Microsoft Windows Server 2012 R2. So the validated hypervisors here, you can see the 2. Other hypervisors that we still continue to support in the sense of you can utilize them as well. I think what's not recommended is the Windows 2008 R2. They're supported but not recommended because of that virtual core CPU limitation of 4. You can't get the full utilization for Lync Server. But also, too, is that you need to think there's actually a networking connection issue. There's actually a knowledge base article you need to download, an update for that. So you need to go to that article and download it. So there's some additional work there. What's not supported is Server 2008, Windows Server 2008. So talk about overhead. So typically, because you're on software and stuff, this is without any user load. Okay, this is just the typical overhead that we saw was around 6 to 10%. That's not including then when you start using the Lync stress tool and start applying the user load onto that environment, right? Because it's software on software, you're always going to hit that layer of abstraction, and you always take a hit as a result of that. But you want to go above and beyond what the virtual guest requires. Factors to consider is the CPU and memory. Okay, the net increase of the physical servers due to the virtualization. So the amount of guests you have, you're also going to impact the host, right? So think about that and the amount of overhead you now are going to cause between the two. One that comes up a lot is using some type of templating, right? We want to stamp and be able to quickly spin up our other guests. One thing that's interesting here is you cannot run sysprep to create the machine image templates after Lync Server 2013 is installed. So what you do is do the OS first, get the template that was sysprep, then in fact do the sysprep with the Lync server, but after it's installed, you can't go back and change things, right, or do a template as a result of that. So we recommend that you do a custom OS template with the applicable prerequisites. So a good example of that is front ends requiring IIS. It's also requiring the Windows Media Format runtime as well. There's a couple of reasons. One is that it's actually snapshotted based on the home users and everything like that. So you've got some persistent data that's now sitting there, and it tries to capture all of that because of SQL, as you mentioned there. And the minute you try and do that again, it's like, hang on a minute, where are the users homed? You can't have that clean, no user on it because you've got to define the users sitting on that server, and it gets that from the Active Directory, so you don't have a choice, right? Because you're commissioning that server in. But that's the reason why. So this one again, you can understand this one, right? Live migration and quick migration is not supported, right? And part of the reason is that you're going to affect the real-time media traffic, right? You're going to cause interruptions if you even try and attempt this, and again, it's not supported. Though you can move your virtual guest, your machine, between hosts, and what you must do is shut down that guest prior to moving it. Obviously, if the user's homed, they're going to move across, you're going to have resiliency mode, etc. Then you will get some type of outage observed by the client, depending on what they're doing. For example, if they're in a conference, they'll definitely get kicked out, and then they'll have to rejoin. Other aspects, IMMP will just resume again, and it'll restart. So just be conscious of that one. Memory here, so dynamic memory, again, don't have that for any of the roles. Memory must not be over-provisioned. So this is an interesting part when you're thinking about VMware in the back of your mind. All the over-provisioning features that they have. Lync doesn't like that. You'll actually starve the guest VMs if you start over-provisioning memory. Here we go. Let's talk about virtual disks. So use fixed disks. Don't use the dynamic disks, right? Because using the new format, actually, this is an interesting part that we observed. The VHDX, which is the new format that's in Server 2012 for the disk, virtualization disk, we found it was giving native to physical performance. We actually didn't notice a huge amount of difference with that. Again, depending on your disk subsystem, you saw that we were running 15K disk mechanical disks, right? We were configured in a pretty optimal performance. You may actually get more if you're running SSD. Again, we saw one of the things too is that by having the fixed disk, we got better performance as opposed to dynamic expanding disks. Again, we don't recommend that because, it's got to expand on that, and you're causing resources on the host to be able to cater for that, and also affecting the guest in some extent. Differentiating disks or dynamic expanding disks are not supported. The underlying storage can overcommit as a result. So allocate fixed-sized virtual disks to a static amount of disk storage or disk space. Do not store, and this is, I think, the obvious one for virtualization, but I'll say it again, is that don't store the system files on the same drives as storing the VM guests. Okay, thank you for the laugh, because, yeah, that's kind of, but I still come across it. Obviously, it's going to cause disk contention issues where they're thrashing between the OS, the host OS, and the guests. So be conscious of that. Here's an interesting one, and I said I was going to talk about this one. Do not use checkpoints for virtual machines. All right? So checkpointing creates a secondary drive which can reduce performance. Anyone like to take a stab at why? What's going on there? Sorry? Thank you. Yeah, you definitely. So what happens is that when you checkpoint, the new beyond that checkpoint, it'll do reads out of both, but it'll actually only do writes on the one disk, but you're going to hit performance because it's doing reads out of both the drives, both the former and at the checkpoint. And then the writes, it'll actually write down onto after the checkpoint. So yeah, you get hit performance because it's doing the read out of that. That's a good point. Thank you.
So does it matter if you have B disk that is at the stable storage pattern or pool of storage? You can have multiple B disks, but if the backend of the host of the storage is the same, does it really matter?
No, yeah. Think of it as more like a logical container. You're subject to what the physical hardware has got underlying if you've got multiple. In the white paper, we actually talk about how we did the disk split up. And you'll see it in just exactly that. We did it more from a container point of view because you saw in the previous diagram of the external disk and the internal disk that we had, we did exactly that. That's a good point.
So performance issues aside, are there any technical reasons say during patch windows, people might want to snapshot, apply patches, if there are problems they can roll back. Are there technical reasons why we shouldn't do that?
We didn't encounter any technical issues. I'm looking at Brandon. We didn't look at the technical. No, we didn't hit any technical issues. It was more performance.
Okay, I wouldn't look at, personally, I wouldn't look at it for long term, but just during a patch window when they're applying.
Right.
Snapshots.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a good point. No problem. Let's talk about the Virtual IDE and SCSI. So Virtual IDE controller is used to boot up the virtual machine. Then all other drives can be attached to the virtual SCSI controller. One thing to think about is that with virtual SCSI, you can have 64 connected disks per controller, and with the virtual and 4 controllers per virtual machine. One thing about virtual SCSI is it supports the hot add and remove of disks, while Virtual IDE doesn't. Also, too, is that it gives you greater flexibility when you're using virtual SCSI as opposed to using the Virtual IDE. And also, too, is if you're using virtual SCSI, then you can actually also use the, if you use virtualized Lync server, then you can also use the fiber channels storage solutions around with that as well. So let's look at the guest storage here. So guest storage depends on a number of factors. That is, the storage is locally attached or use of a stand. I think that was where the other gentleman was going. There are 2 methods that you can provide. You can do in-guest iSCSI, or you can do a virtual fiber channel. Some of the best practices for the guest storage that we recommend is that operating system boot drive. You can be mapped to the virtual, well, it has to be mapped to the Virtual IDE drive because it's booting up. The SQL Server workloads and binaries could use the Virtual IDE drive. So your binary, the actual SQL Server product, could be used in the Virtual IDE, or the operating system drive. Then your guest servers, if you want to move them around, then you want to use the iSCSI targets and directly expose the guest server to that. So let's just talk a little bit more about the host requirements here. I think I've sort of highlighted this again. For host requirements, resource over-allocation, so don't over-allocate on your CPU. We do continue to support, this was the same with 2010 and it's the same for 2013, is mixing physical and virtual servers. So what this essentially means is that in my environment, I could have a mixture of physical and virtual. So if I've got a user pool, front ends, back end, I can have my front ends virtual and I can have my back end physical. All right? And the lowest common unit is it's based on the pool. So if I have a series of edges, they're going to be, because it's a pool, right, a pool of edges, they've got to be virtual or physical. It's all or nothing, right? So be conscious of that one. Physical to virtual CPU ratio, again, oversubscription, big no-no. Again, then you need to think about with antivirus, all right, that only deploy the antivirus software on the VM host to root partition. All right. The requirements there, host redundancy, so the environment should be fully redundant. That is, you saw in the lab that the work that we did where we spread the roles across multiple physical hosts, all right, to give us that level of redundancy. Probably the most one that you saw me harp about a little bit was the front end and back end. You saw we took great care in splitting that across the physical hosts, all right, because that's where the activity is happening the most. Some host networking considerations. Again, the host is going to have a dedicated network adapter. The shared usage is not supported. You can do it, but it's not supported by Microsoft. Correct sizing should also be done to handle the workload on the host server. And there's actually the support policy for if you want to do some NIC teaming with Hyper-V. Also, enable the VLAN tagging on the host NIC as well. Again, having that separation is going to give you great support around things such as if you wanted to implement the multipath I/O, and that is to your storage for the back-end server. Again, here VMQ is supported, but you need the appropriate drivers for VMQ, and you also need either Broadcom or Intel for that type of support. Let's talk about guest requirements. So here's the guest requirements, guest core requirements. So Hyper-V doesn't have any limitation to the number of CPU cores on server 2012. I thought everyone would be cheering on that one. I was so excited about that one. Other third-party hypervisors may be limited to 8 cores. It depends on the hypervisor you're using. Again, that SVVP list that's on our website, Microsoft.com, it shows you, in fact, the hypervisors supported and what workloads they support, what products they support. So the guest operating system, again, Windows Server 2012, R2 is preferred. You can do 2008 R2. In our lab, we actually did everything Server 2012, host and guest. We didn't use 2008 R2 as the guest, just a FYI. But there's nothing stopping you from doing that. Talk a little bit about guest requirements around the virtual NIC, legacy versus synthetic. One thing that you need to be conscious around using the legacy adapter, you actually get a lower data transfer. For example, it emulates the Intel 21140 based PCI Ethernet adapter. Usually, it's in the amount of performance you can get, 1 gigabits per second. It's actually or faster. It's very low. If you use the synthetic adapters, which is the preferred, you actually get what they call a dedicated VM bus. And this is the way that it works from the guest to the host, right, the virtual and physical NIC configuration. The nice thing about doing this, and that I've noticed, is that you're actually going to get a lower results or reduced results around your CPU cycles by using your synthetic adapter versus the legacy. I can't remember off the top of my head the exact how much we got, but we saw some significant gains on CPU cycles because it's got to manage that relationship you're using legacy. If you're using the synthetic, it doesn't have to as much. Here's the single root I/O virtualization, or SRIOV. Again, it's only available in Windows Server 2012 and up, so Windows Server 2008 R2 doesn't support it. Here's what's interesting is it provides the extensions to the PCI Express, like network adapters to separate the access. It's creating a virtual switch inside the Windows Server product. Again, when you use SRIOV, legacy network adapter is actually not supported, so you're not going to be able to use it. One important point, as I mentioned earlier, is make sure that you work with your hardware vendor because it does require specific hardware that supports that, and also they may need to give you BIOS updates. Certainly we found that out with the HP hardware. Guest requirements 2. This is a really interesting one. I get this one a lot. IP version 4 and IP version 6. And really, it's not recommended to mix the two. You can do it, but you hit a performance issue, right? Because there's translations happening between the IP version 6 and IP version 4. If you're running an IP version 6 network only, knock yourself out. Run just IP version 6, right? If you're running just an IP version 4 network environment, just run IP version 4, all right? That's really the really important part. The other part is disable the virtual DVD and CD drives in the guest, right? You don't need them. You don't need them, so disable them. The only time you need them initially is to actually install the components that it requires, for the guest components. That's the only time you really need them. Well, nearly finished. Yep. So, part 1, session summary here. We talked about why virtualize. We talked about the hardware and software approach. We talked about some deployment practices, performance and scale. We went through and talked about the KHIs. We also looked at the really high-level testing approach. Tomorrow, Seth's going to go in a lot more detail using the test plan document, which we also provide. Again, I want to stress that those documents actually launched yesterday, in case you didn't realize. I was hoping some of our staff were social networking, letting you guys know. So if you go to Microsoft.com downloads, you can download both the guides and start reading them. They're about 70 pages in one and about 50, 60 pages in the other. Just some light reading. Yeah. But certainly better than 2010. That's one thing I'm very happy about. All right. Questions? Oh, typo. Yowzers. Thank you. Good catch.
Yeah.
I'll give you a card on that one. You don't need to know about that version. Good typo catch. Yes, 2013, not 2014.
Okay, so you told us you were going to tell us about scaling to smaller deployments.
Right. So one of the things that you saw is that based on, we did the 10,000 users using the default user profile, right? So what you can do then is scale back your users down to 500 and use the default user profile and then see what performance you get from that. And you can start scaling it up from that. So start with, you've got to start, if you're using Enterprise Edition, for example, you've got to start with a minimum of 3 front ends in the back end, right? And then start using what type of capacity you can get out of that with, say, I think the gentleman said 500 users from that point. One thing I didn't call out specifically, and it's in the document, is we did test standard edition. So we actually went through and tested virtualization for a standard edition, which is a common ask as well. So being able to go and scale and test that, again, I don't know what your 500 users are doing, whether it's just IMP, whether it's voice and video, or all of the above. In our example that you saw here, we turned on everything because we wanted to see that.
So there must be a minimum that's supported, is there not?
A minimum support. Why would we?
Minimum amount of resources. So if we take 32 gigs,
Mm-hmm.
12 processors,
Mm-hmm.
and we have 1/10 that much, I'm sure that 1.2 processors is not supported.
So our minimum hardware requirements are the dual core hex core dual processor, 32 gig of RAM.
That's not a language that TNA uses.
It's a recommendation, right?
Yeah, the thing to think about. The thing to think about is online we publish a usage model. We have a profile that we use to test in our labs to make sure that, hey, you can run this usage model, and this is the hardware that we recommend for that usage model. Now, unfortunately, every customer is going to be different. And if you have more AV conferencing, you're going to see more network impact. You're going to see more proc impact. If you're using video versus not using video, you're going to see different impacts. So trying to come up with a formula to try to help you guys figure that out would be great, and hopefully someday we have that. But for today, that's why we provide things like the test tool to go and tweak and use that test tool to mimic what your usage model is, and then go and look at what the impact is.
So that seems fine. It's either that you would have to model our environment.
Right.
Correct.
Right.
It might be helpful if you could model more in one environment.
That would be great.
That
The other problem is support. When the partners go to Microsoft support, Microsoft says, here as a tag as a dual hex core.
Right.
Oh, you don't have a dual hex core. Please come up when you have a dual hex core. You says, okay, the partner must test it, but in the support, Microsoft says when you don't have a dual hex core, then you have no support. So it's,
Right.
It's maybe a different. We also, Microsoft must understand that in the standard edition, we don't have as a maximum. We must have a mid-size. A mid-size are going to 500 to 1,000 users.
Right.
So, and when we have the maximum for the standard at
Yep.
500,000 users, then you must have a dual hex core. But for a smaller edition, and please, what's the problem for Microsoft and to write in a tag? Okay, that's for the maximum, and the minimum for 500 till 500 users are that.
Right. I think it's really economy of scale. Like if I asked every single person in this room, what's your hardware, how many users you got, I would get, I don't know, 50 plus different answers, right? And that's really that's the issue at the crux of the issue, right? Is we can't test every single environment and say here's the minimum hardware that for these particular users based on the profile that you're using for those users, etc. You did add an important point, and the important point is around support. So that our support around is those recommendations that we have on TechNet today. That's what we have. Yes, come on the mic. This man's very passionate about it.
I apologize if I'm pressing a little hard.
No, that's all right. Press hard.
But we need some guidelines. I mean, I'm not a customer. It's not my own system. This is for customers I'm designing and architecting systems for.
Right.
If I have a customer with 2,000 users,
Right.
what is my supportable configuration?
At the
Please, can you
hardware,
tell me?
at the hardware level, or
At
all
the
up.
hardware level. And there's many aspects to that. What about if I'm using AMD 16-core servers, 16-core processors? I mean, are we saying that you could, because Dell has done a lot of testing and they
Right.
find that they're,
Right.
a core is a core.
Right. Right. So
But what is the minimum supportable? I still don't think we got that answer.
the minimum supported is what's on TechNet today.
So it's 12 processors
Right.
and 32 gigs
Yep.
for a front-end server.
Yep.
For one user till
That's the default hardware
Yeah.
that we have today.
6 hours or 5 hours.
That's
Correct?
that's the default recommendation is what we have today. That's on TechNet. I think what you're answering about,
You know,
well,
I've taken that approach because
Yep.
I can't really take the liability of the customer calling Microsoft and saying it's not supported.
agree.
But that is a little crazy to throw that much hardware at
I think what's
500 or 2,000 users.
I think what's interesting is that hardware is evolving, and one of the things that we're working very close with is our hardware vendors, such as HP and such as Dell, to look at what they provide from their hardware and where things are going from that. So we take this default stance because trying to give a common hardware across all the different vendors, right? It's really tricky. You highlight AMD as a perfect example, right? Plus, it's difficult for us to go in and test every single permutation of hardware and default user load and so on. What we want to try and do is give you, hopefully, the tools to be able to do that so that you're in. So when you have that conversation with your customer and say, it's 32 gig of RAM, it's got to have the dual hex core, you can actually provide some guidance and information of why that you've seen here today. Also, the Lync stress tool, default user profile, key health indicators, to have that engaging conversation, open their eyes, right? If we said, here's the minimum, I guarantee I get an email the next day saying, well, why is this thing falling over? Right? Yeah.
Think about this, you've got IM and presence. If your customers are only using that, we're not going to need the high bandwidth requirements from a network standpoint. And I give you guys a lot of grief because we've had some
That's
issues
fair.
around that, but completely understand the situation you're in because, for example, we're deploying 1,100 seats, and 380 of those seats are going to be IM and presence only, 600. I can't go to you guys and say, give me a set of hardware requirements and system requirements on my VMware infrastructure because it's going to be different. I'm also using HP blade infrastructure with virtual connection.
Wow, okay.
Maybe that, you can't. You just can't.
Yeah, we can't.
And I got to leverage the key health indicators plus virtual connect information from HP on top of VMware.
That's one of the hacks. It's a really difficult situation for us to be able to say, for you, it's just this, and for you, it's just this. Because it depends, like how long is a piece of string. But what we try to do with the information that we're provided now is, like I said at the beginning of this presentation, is cover a multitude of different audiences. Give them enough information so they can actually be engaged with whether themselves within their organization, with another customer. I have Dell and HP are going to take this stuff and start their testing and do their rollouts internally in their labs. I mean, there's a lot of momentum having this. And part of this is like, what are my KHIs? If you ever go back, here's a litmus test, right? And I'm not sort of trying to move off, but here's a key test. Go and look at the Lync Server 2010 white paper on virtualization. Then come back to me. Because there was none of this was in there. And I don't know how people virtualized in 2010. I give them full marks, full credit for doing that. It would have been very difficult. Yeah.
One of them is slightly different question to ask.
Sure.
Why does the system chat front end need the same resources as the transition front end? Because that's what happens when I have sticks, right? Instead of
So make sure I understand that question because you mixed a few things there. So you got group chat. Yep. Right. Why? Because that's the recommendation we put right across for our roles.
Yeah.
Again, you'll use persistent chat today. I don't know what you're going to use tomorrow. I don't know how your users use persistent chat. Right, but we have to have, from a support point of view, a common platform to work from, a common base to work from. That's the reason why.
If you're saying that we need to test, so if we test and prove that we tested the stress test, then if it's less than your recommended, is it still will be supported with you that we did the testing?
Yeah, I mean, I heard this gentleman's comment about going to product support and them just coming back. Yeah. And I mean, a lot of it comes to, if you go to support and you're having a proc utilization issue, they're probably going to look and say you don't have you're not meeting the recommended bar. If you're going to them because you're having some config issue, and you're not meeting the minimum bar, they're probably still going to give you support. I'd be surprised if they didn't give you support.
Yeah.
I do like the feedback about a minimum. I do think this is something we can take back. I mean, we don't actually go and write these minimums from a physical perspective. We're talking about virtualization today, but that's definitely something I'm going to take back and see if we can do something about.
Definitely. I think the gentleman over here made a really interesting point about the Exchange side of the house. This stuff is not set in stone. So from the test plan guide you're going to see tomorrow, we're going to iterate that every 6 months. We're going to update it, right? We don't want it to go stale. We want it to get that feedback from you guys, from customers, from partners, etc., and rev it further, based on the feedback we get, and head towards the Exchange-like model. Right? This was a significant change for us in the virtualization amount of material that we needed to provide, right? And we wanted to make sure that you got that first in your minds, and then we now can have the next stage of conversation, next stage of material, if you like. Think of it like that.
Is it appropriate for asks?
Yeah, please.
Can we ask for a minimum supportable?
Sure. We can take that back to the product group and look at that. Yeah, no, it's definitely. And we're hearing that loud and clear. Yes? Right. Yep. Right. Yeah, where the one you've got to watch the throttling is on the SQL Express. That's the limiting factor. It's the SQL Express. You saw the result that it's tied to the first 4 cores. That's one you've got to weigh in. Yeah. Yes.
I was also curious about putting the witness on one of the front-end servers. Doesn't seem like that makes sense.
Database witness? Like backend?
The mirror witness.
Mirror witness. Wasn't on the backend. No, we didn't do that. No, it was in the backend. Right. And part of the reason we did that was the amount of hardware we had, actually, to tell you the truth.
Yeah.
Correct. Yeah. One last question, because I go. That's right. Is it 3216? Sorry. 3216.
I thought it was actually 16, but
Yeah.
I could.
I'll double check that one because I saw that to 16. I'm going to give you a card though for picking that up, but actually check. Yeah, I think it was 16 too. It's not 22.
On front ends, back ends, standard edition, and persistent chat back end as well. So.
Yeah. Thank you.